all you literary lunches and luminaries. I'm Julie and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. Today's book is the result of watching a documentary on Prime. The book is Little Girl Blue, The Life of Karen Carpenter by Randy L. Schmidt. In August, I watched Karen Carpenter, Starving for Perfection. In that documentary, Randy L. Schmidt was interviewed. I ordered the book immediately. The only other book I read about Karen Carpenter was Ray Coleman's The Carpenters, a biography which had the family's blessing, so I knew it was heavily censored by Richard. Yet I squealed when I found this book at my used bookstore because it was The Carpenters. And also heavily censored because Richard was a producer is the Cynthia Gibb 1989 TV movie, The Karen Carpenter Story. So I couldn't wait to read Little Girl Blue. Perhaps due to my eager anticipation, the book did not live up to my high expectations at all. In case you don't know who the Carpenters were, they were a late 60s and 70s music group. I'd categorize their music as folk/pop. I think their biggest hit was We've Only Just Begun, which by the time I was born was already 7 years old. Yet, We've Only Just Begun was kind of that first song I ever remember declaring as a favorite. Even with it being over 5 years old, it still had plenty of radio play for me to know it. My mom had an eclectic record collection, yet she did not own a Carpenters record. According to her, the Carpenters were so overplayed on the radio that it was difficult to like them. They had become terminally obnoxious. Peter, Paul, and Mary were hippie enough to be cool. The Carpenters were not. In any case, I remember begging my mom to play We've Only Just Begun on the piano since it was in her greatest hits of the 70s songbook. And then when I was in 6th or 7th grade, the TV movie aired, a movie that Lifetime reran endlessly. Karen Carpenter died when she was only 32 years old due to anorexia. Karen is credited with making known what anorexia is. So even though Karen Carpenter died when I was 5 years old, I was a Carpenters fan. So that's how I ended up reading Little Girl Blue. The subtitle says, The Life of Karen Carpenter. Now, I realized to develop Karen's life, one must develop the music and her brother Richard and obviously the rest of her family. Yet the subtitle is heavily misleading. It's not about Karen much at all. It's about Carpenters, with Karen's story a part of that. It is not focused on Karen, even though in his author's note at the beginning, Schmidt makes it clear that he's interviewing people that want Karen's story told. Do good for Karen is allegedly the purpose of the book. Schmidt certainly didn't do Karen wrong, but the book was just simply another Carpenter's book. Schmidt begins writing Karen's story chronologically and then just really doesn't. Then he tries to theme later chapters, so then has to go back in time to certain elements to explain what he hadn't already developed. I hated this approach. I also didn't care much for his style of writing. It's like a student research paper that copies and pastes a whole bunch of lengthy quotes together. Schmidt relies on quotes from his own personal interviews, but many of them come from other articles, other programs, etc. It was too much at times. I prefer the biographies where you have more of a story happening and then the author uses little footnotes so you can access at the back of the book where the information came from. Schmidt's style of writing and organization just didn't work for me. I know that Karen is more than just her eating disorder. I get it. I do not want her reduced to the singer who died because she refused to eat. However, no book has really done that part of her story justice. We get snippets here and there. She was a chubby kid. Some reviewer called her chubby on stage. She dieted and exercised, which at first didn't appear overly problematic, and then she stops eating. Yes, her mother was very controlling. Yes, growing up as Richard's younger sister, she was essentially invisible because everything was about Richard. Yes, being thrown into the spotlight of a highly successful music group probably didn't help matters. All books and documentaries highlight these aspects of her eating disorder, but it just never seems to be told as a story in and of itself. Let me read you an insightful paragraph that came from Time magazine in 1996, not our author, and so he does this throughout the entire book where he pulls other people's quotes. In 1996, Rob Horberger concisely and powerfully summed up Karen Carpenter's tribulations in a New York Times Magazine feature. If anorexia has classically been defined as a young woman's struggle for control, then Karen was a prime candidate for the two things she valued most in the world, her voice and her mother's love, were exclusively the property of Richard. At least she would control the size of her own body. And control it she did. By September 1975, her weight dropped to 91 pounds. I have a feeling that article would have given me just as much info about Karen as this book. And that's my problem with the book. Even with its subtitle, the book is not focused on Karen. About a third of the book could have been eliminated because it was all about the songs and where each one came from and what Richard did with them. That has little to do with Karen. Karen was not the creative mastermind behind the music. She was the iconic voice that sang the music. So I don't know why any of that is in the book. Schmidt attempts to make known that everyone knew Karen was sick. Despite anorexia not being part of the vernacular in the early 1970s, early 1980s, people who were close to her knew about it. Let me read you a good summary of this. And this is something that Schmidt did a little bit better here. Band members and others made aware of her condition agreed that Karen fit the description of anorexia to a T. Backstage, they witnessed her exhaustion. She was lying down between shows, something she had rarely, if ever, done before. They were shocked to see how she could be flat on her back one minute and on stage singing the next. Even when doing back-to-back shows, Karen displayed a tremendous amount of nervous energy, said Sherwin Bash. He was a no-nonsense kind of man who freely spoke his mind and had no qualms confronting Karen on the issue of anorexia, even calling it by name, and he did not back down. The fact that she was anorexic was discussed innumerable times. There was every attempt to get her to seek professional help, but I believe her family was the kind of family that the mother would say, "We can take care of ourselves. We don't need to have someone. This is a family matter." According to Ellis, at times Karen seemed to seek the attention of her family and did not mind it coming at the expense of their frustrations with her disorder. When she dieted or over-dieted, as he explains, there was a rush of attention from the family, especially Agnes. Karen had never had attention before, so she liked it. The experts say that one of the things that seemed to drive young girls to diet and over-diet is that they were oftentimes the kids that never got attention. It's a way of getting the love from their family that they never got before. I think at times when we assess Karen's illness, we have a tendency to cheapen it by saying no one knew about it at the time. Yet those close to her saw all the classic traits of anorexia. Her mother knew something was wrong too, and Karen even sought treatment. That's the part I think we miss when we flippantly talk about Karen's death as if anorexia was such a novel illness that no one knew how to treat it, and that's why she died. While there is no doubt much more help today for battling eating disorders, when Karen died, those closest to her had seen her look deathly ill. They even knew the name of the illness, although some admit to not knowing how to pronounce it. While Schmidt kind of develops this, he really doesn't do it justice, much like everything else in the book. And then the ipecac. If you aren't aware, it wasn't her low weight that killed Karen. It was her heart, which had weakened thanks to Karen's use of ipecac. In the later years of her eating disorder, Karen switched to binging and purging, more bulimia than anorexia, yet she couldn't make herself throw up. She used ipecac instead. The way Schmidt writes about this is infuriating. First of all, the family refuses to believe that Karen ever used ipecac. I don't know why they are so against this. Coleman, in his authorized biography, even tells the reader this. Schmidt decides not to tell us about the ipecac until after he writes of Karen's death, then throws it in afterwards with multiple people stating they knew Karen was using ipecac. I felt that was kind of a cheap way for Schmidt to write about it. Put it as part of the story, not some sort of a plot twist. I only really learned two things from this book. First, that Karen wasn't such a nice person. Schmidt doesn't develop this much, but obviously her friends discuss how gracious and nice and funny she was. But a few who worked with her didn't think she was always so nice. That's refreshing to see both perspectives, that Karen could be just as ruthless as her mom at times, and that she expected perfectionism from all those around her. The second thing is in regards to her therapist, Stephen Levenkron, the writer of the novel The Best Little Girl in the World, a book about anorexia, and he became Karen's therapist, which I knew that part already. But I didn't realize he wasn't a real doctor, but it's a bit confusing. Counselors and therapists aren't doctors, psychiatrists are, so I'm not sure what the shock is from her friends that he wasn't a medical doctor. Online, it just says he's a psychotherapist. So while that was fascinating, Schmidt does little in the book to confirm or deny or even clarify Levenkron's qualifications, simply using what other people said to him and then letting it hang out in the air like that. And that's a large part of my problem with the book. It's as if Schmidt does haphazard research. When someone tells him something, he doesn't go out of his way to research further information, especially if it's not already in his cache of interviews or articles. He appeared to do little research about anorexia outside of Karen Carpenter. While he brings up laxatives all the time, he doesn't develop much of it. Karen's eating habits are all discussed within the interviews. He doesn't take eating disorders in the context of the 1970s either and compare it to today. The book was just not what I hoped it would be, but perhaps I'm being too harsh since I already knew a lot about Karen Carpenter's life. So here's the thing. If you want to read about Karen Carpenter's life with anorexia, you can read Little Girl Blue, but I don't know if it's going to give you the information you want. If you're wanting to know more about eating disorders, Little Girl Blue is probably not going to give you too much. If you're interested in Karen Carpenter's life, the book is okay if you have never read anything about her. Ultimately, Little Girl Blue was another Carpenter's biography. I found Coleman's book, although heavily censored by Richard, more informative and better written. Coleman tells you when the family disagreed with his information. Perhaps read Coleman's book instead, and then do your own research. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.